I know it's probably strange to say, but being a park ranger in a famous national park can sometimes be very disturbing. Take it from me. I'm not complaining, but one day in particular really gave me the chills. I was working at Grand Teton National Park in 1988. I had been there for about a year, and it was my favorite park to work in until that day. Mostly because of how dark and quiet it could get. Basically, it was really peaceful. There are no really big towns or cities anywhere near it. The nearest town is Jackson, which has a population of just over 10,000 people. So needless to say, when I'm working at night, I can often see more stars than most people might ever see in their lifetime. So I was sitting in my patrol vehicle near the Snake River watching the stars and relaxing as I was finishing up my patrol for the evening. The overlook I was at is pretty much exactly what you would imagine an overlook at Grand Teton National Park to be like. It's located along a stretch of road where there are pullouts every so often where tourists can get out and take pictures with the Tetons as a backdrop. So I'm sitting there just relaxing when all of a sudden I hear this loud, high-pitched scream coming from the woods. I'm not a hunter or anything, but I've been a ranger long enough to know that whatever made that sound was not an animal. It almost sounded like someone was literally screaming as loud as they could while trying to imitate an elk or something at the same time. But it only lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then it stopped just as quickly as it started. I'm sitting there kind of freaking out and trying to figure out what it was when all of a sudden I see something moving in the trees right where I heard the noise come from. At first I thought maybe it was one of those mountain lions that people occasionally see roaming around these parts, but then I realized how big this thing was compared to the tree next to it. Whatever this thing was, it looked like it was almost as big as the tree. I could barely make out what I think looked like 2 very large eyes staring at me from behind a branch. I'm sitting there frozen in fear when all of a sudden this thing starts to move again, and I see something that made my blood run cold. The thing had no feathers or fur, it didn't have any antlers or horns, but the way it moved reminded me exactly of how an elk moves, only much faster and smoother. Its massive body just seemed to glide through the trees without making a single sound whatsoever. And then suddenly it was gone, just like that. The only reason I knew it left was because I stopped hearing the branches breaking off in the distance every few seconds, and instead I heard nothing but crickets chirping in the distance. After about 10 minutes of sitting there shivering in my truck, I finally gathered the courage to get out. I walked over to where I had seen whatever it was moving through the trees, and I looked around for any signs of tracks or anything, but there was nothing. The ground was too hard and dry for me to find anything, so after checking a few nearby trees for claw marks or teeth marks, there were none. I decided that what I saw just must have been an elk. Maybe one that had mange or something? Who knows? Anyway, I was done for the night, and so I headed back to base to close up my shift. I worked another 3 nights after that one with no problems, but then on the 4th night, something happened that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a Saturday night in September, so there were more tourists than usual visiting the park. There's usually a bit of a rush in September since it's basically the last chance before winter comes around. I had just finished doing a walkthrough at Jenny Lake Campground, which is located just outside of Jackson Hole and right inside the park, when I noticed an older couple sitting by their RV looking pretty upset. Their dog, who they said was an Australian shepherd named Max, had run off somewhere into the woods behind their campsite about 30 minutes ago and hadn't come back. So I told them not to worry because dogs are pretty good at finding their way back. I told them not to leave their campsite and that I would go find him. So I grabbed my flashlight and I headed into the woods behind their campsite. It's funny because when you're a park ranger, people automatically assume that you know everything about nature and animals. But the truth is, I honestly get a bit scared at night patrolling by myself because of all the stories I've heard from other rangers about bears, mountain lions, all kinds of animals roaming around looking for food. Anyway, so I'm walking through the woods with my flashlight on, looking everywhere for Max, when suddenly something makes a noise to my right. At first I thought it was Max finally coming back, but then I realized how big this thing was compared to me when its shadow passed over me, as it ran past in front of my flashlight beam. This thing had to have been at least twice as tall as me, and it moved so fast. There's no way that it was a dog. I thought maybe it was one of those elk again, but then I remembered that what I saw the last time was way bigger than any elk would ever be. So I started to get really scared and ran back to the vehicle as fast as I could. I sat in it for about 10 minutes trying to calm down after seeing whatever this thing was. I didn't even go back to the couple at the campsite. And then, as I was sitting there, all of a sudden something slammed into the side of my vehicle so hard that it shook the whole vehicle. Whatever it was had now jumped up on the hood, and then it launched itself at my windshield. It sounded like somebody throwing a bowling ball at full speed right at me. I have no idea how this thing didn't crash through my windshield. I've seen it happen to a few rangers before. I never expected to be on the receiving end of something like that, though. And then I watched as it just stopped and stared at me. It was like it knew that I was protected by the car and it couldn't get to me. So it just gave up and walked away. As I looked at it, its snout looked longer than most wolves I've ever seen before. Its fur was a strange shade of gray, not white. But what freaked me out the most about it is that I could still feel that it was staring right into my soul. It's hard to describe. So I started my vehicle and I drove back to the ranger station as fast as I could. When I got there, I immediately told my supervisor what had happened, and he said that I was probably just imagining things. He said that there's no way anything could jump up onto a vehicle and then into the windshield like that hard, without breaking it. He said that maybe I had seen elk or deer or something, but I told him about how big the thing was compared to my size when it ran past me, and how fast it moved. His only response was, "Then you need to get yourself checked out by a doctor." Which shocked me, honestly. It was totally unprofessional. I quit my job at Grand Teton National Park 2 months later after having nightmares almost every night about whatever that thing was that attacked my vehicle. It wasn't a normal animal, of this I'm certain. Whatever it was seems to be highly intelligent, and a creature that is very much capable of killing you. Because of this, I just couldn't stay at that job any longer. I hope you all understand. I was on patrol one night when I got a call from dispatch. They told me that there had been reports coming in of strange lights in the woods near an old abandoned house in the woods at the edge of town, and they asked me to investigate it. When I arrived at the location, there were already several people standing around looking into the woods. A few of them were carrying flashlights, but mostly they just stood in the darkness, staring into the trees. As I walked up to them and asked what was going on, everyone turned to look at me with a serious expression on their faces. And then one man pointed off towards the old house and said, "You see that house way over there in the woods?" I squinted and looked where he pointed and saw a small abandoned shack about 50 yards into the woods. It looked like it had been long deserted. From what I could see, most of its gray paint had chipped or peeled away, leaving only patches of it on the weathered wood. I nodded and he continued, "Well, many of us have been seeing lights in those trees swirling around that house." He paused for a moment to look at me seriously before continuing. "And some of us think that they are alien lights." With that, we all turned back to stare into the darkness again with renewed interest. I stood there for a moment trying to decide if they were pulling my leg or not. They all seemed serious enough, so I decided to humor them and took a few steps towards where it had become darker. As I stood there quietly, I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me, and I turned to see another man walking up to me. He was an older gentleman with a long white beard that reached down to his chest. As he walked past me towards the darkness, I asked him if he was going to the house. He stopped and looked at me with a serious expression on his face, just like everyone else's. But then in a deep, gravelly voice, he said, "I've seen them before." And that was all he said before continuing on in the darkness. After watching him walk off into the blackness, I stood there for several moments trying to decide what to do next when suddenly someone screamed from somewhere in the woods ahead of me. It sounded like a woman screaming for help, or perhaps it was someone being attacked by something horrible. Either way, it was coming from the direction that the older gentleman had just gone. Instantly, my adrenaline kicked in, and I pulled my flashlight from my belt and started running towards the screams. As I ran through the darkness, it became harder to see because of the trees, until finally they were so close together that only a small patch of sky was visible above me. And then just ahead of me, I saw a clearing with an old rusted pickup truck parked near it. Instantly, my mind registered that this must be near the old abandoned house, and so I stopped to look around for the lights or anything unusual, but everything seemed normal enough. And that's when I heard someone screaming again. This time it sounded like it came from behind me. I turned to look back into the dark woods, but could see nothing except pinpoint patches of light coming from flashlights carried by people standing way back at the edge of town, near where I started. And then suddenly another scream came from somewhere behind me. I turned to look back into the woods again, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the small clearing now was the old man with the long white beard. He stood there motionless, staring at me with his arms just hanging by his sides. Instantly, my adrenaline kicked in again, and I pulled out my pistol and I pointed it at him, but he didn't move or even flinch. Instead, he just kept looking at me as if waiting for something. Suddenly, another scream came from behind, so without taking my gun off of him, I turned to look back into the woods, and that's when I saw them. 2 glowing orange spheres were flying through the trees towards us. As they passed each tree, their light would shine through, causing bright spots on the ground beneath them. It was so surreal I can't even really describe it. They were coming towards us at a very high speed, and I could only watch in amazement as they flew past me and flew to the old man standing before me. As the glowing spheres went around him, he lifted his arms into the air and began spinning like a top. His white beard was flying around behind him while he spun faster and faster until suddenly he disappeared. And that's when I heard another scream simultaneously coming from somewhere. Instantly I turned, looking around all through the dark woods again, but all that remained was darkness, and with only a few flashlight beams shining through it from the people, I could see nothing. The next thing I knew, someone grabbed my arm and pulled me away from where I stood in the blackness. When I turned to look at who had grabbed me, I saw it was one of my fellow police officers, and when I asked him what had happened, he just shook his head and said that it was time to go. Back at the police station, I tried to tell some of my fellow officers about what had happened, but they all just shook their heads and acted as if they didn't want to hear about it. Finally, one of them told me that several people called in claiming that they saw flying saucers, but that the department had been told to keep the sightings internal and not release any info to the public. After a few days passed and nothing more was ever said about it, I eventually convinced myself that maybe I had been imagining things, due to the darkness and the adrenaline rush from chasing the screams through the woods. Either way, it was the strangest thing I've ever experienced in my life. So strange that even I doubt it really happened sometimes. It sort of feels like a dream at this point, but at the same time it's all bottled up inside me. So I had to share it with somebody I hoped would understand and not judge me. That's the hardest part of being a police officer sometimes. Sometimes it's hard to share things like this without looking like a fool. Over the years, there has been no shortage of strange stories coming out of national parks. The one I'm writing to you about took place in the summer of 2015 at Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. A park ranger was on a routine patrol around midnight when he noticed a strange, wolf-like creature sitting on its haunches near the edge of Rim Drive. The ranger pulled his car over to get a better look. He said the animal had long, reddish-brown fur with a white underbelly and light brown spots all over its body. It had pointed ears, a blunt muzzle with large teeth, and very muscular hind legs. He said it appeared to be about 6 feet tall, although it was sitting down, so he later thought that perhaps it was a juvenile. He said its eyes glowed yellow in the headlights of his vehicle. After observing the animal for several minutes, it stood up and began walking towards him on its hind legs. As it approached and came within 15 feet, it dropped to all fours and bolted off into the woods. The ranger described the creature as being very fast, able to run on either 2 legs or 4 with ease. He followed it on foot for a short distance, but lost sight of it once he got to thick vegetation. The following day, another park ranger found tracks that measured 17 inches long by 6 inches wide. The tracks were unusual in that they had 5 distinct claw marks instead of 4, and there were no pads between the toes. A cast was made of one set of prints which revealed an unusual pattern. Several large dots inside a circle with smaller dots on that, similar to what has been observed in Bigfoot tracks over the years. According to sources I spoke with who have worked at Crater Lake National Park, this is not the first time something like this has happened there. In the 1960s, a park ranger reported seeing a strange animal sitting on its haunches near Wizard Island. And then, in more recent years, a ranger found tracks that were very similar to those made by the 2015 creature. Many feel that the most likely explanation for these unusual tracks is that they were left by some kind of large canid, such as a wolf or a coyote. However, given their similarities to Bigfoot tracks and the eyewitness accounts of what appeared to be a bipedal wolf-like cryptid, it's possible that we're looking at an undiscovered species here. If you ask any of the park rangers who work there, they will tell you that the tracks are most likely those of a large canine. However, the fact remains that these tracks are very unusual. It's also worth noting that this area is near Crater Lake, where an unknown object was detected on radar in 1968, and a strange flying object was witnessed by several people in 1973. So take that with a grain of salt, or add that information to the reasons why these sightings could be cryptids. I don't know, but it's an interesting story to think about, either way. This story comes to us from a female park ranger in Alaska in November of 2010. I had just finished my foot patrol in the mountains at Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska. It gets really cold there, as you can imagine, so we always had kept our cars close by, and thankfully the night patrols were at least shorter than the daytime patrols, just to keep us safe in these months when darkness seems to last forever. I was heading towards the trailhead at that time of day when darkness becomes full-on night, when I heard rustling, sort of like something heavy coming up behind me, but in the brush beside the trail. The first thought that crossed my mind was moose, but that would be strange because the sides of the trail seemed too dense for a moose to pass through. My next thought was that it was maybe a wolf or a bear, both of which, by the way, if necessary, I would use force to protect myself against. So I stopped and listened, not seeing anything in the darkness, but hearing this sound getting closer. And then a shape appeared beside me on the trail about 20 feet in front, and it continued past me down the trail and towards the trailhead. It looked like a large animal at first, but it was running on its hind legs, and something seemed wrong with its head. I couldn't make out details, though, and it kept going until it veered off down into the brush, heading in the direction of my car. I saw enough of it, though, to know that whatever this animal was, it wasn't natural here as far as wildlife goes in Alaska, and that's saying a lot. But I remained skeptical, thinking that a thin or sickly bear or something got spooked by a wolf or something else and was just running away. And if that were the case, it wouldn't want to have anything to do with me. I would just have to tread lightly getting back down to my car. After taking it slow, I got to the road with the clearing behind it, and the next thing I knew, suddenly the blaring of my car alarm started. My car was off to the right behind the last bit of brush, but I immediately noticed that its headlights were blinking on and off and my car alarm was screaming. Meanwhile, I was too busy scrambling for my keys that I completely missed what was really happening. And it goes without saying that I really wasn't expecting what I saw next. I realized something was looking at me, so I looked up, expecting a bear, preparing to do what I needed to do and placing my hand over my pistol, but all I could do was scream. There on the top of the hood of my car was this gigantic beast. The top of its head reminded me of a buck or moose with crooked antlers. What I could make out from the face was hideous, sunken in like a zombie with these lidless eyeballs, the only things light-colored on it. It stood up straight, denting the hood of my car and setting off the alarm. I could tell from its shadow that it had fur on its body, but only a bit, and it had bony limbs and a bony body. At the end of its human-looking hands were claws, and its feet looked like hooves. It roared like it was 7 different animals roaring all at once. I clicked off the alarm and without realizing my hand was still on the button, and then there was an eerie silence between us for a second before it took off into the clearing on all 4s. I watched it go off as it charged into the foliage. I heard animals making noises and birds took flight even in the darkness to escape whatever that thing was. It took me a while to calm down, to be honest, and get the courage to drive out of there. And when I did, I drove as fast as I felt I could without losing my mind. Thank God I never saw that creature again, and there have been no reports of it since. If you had asked my mother about it, she would say it was a skinwalker. She would tell me about them when I was a kid as a way of scaring me into not wandering off or talking to strangers. She was Native American and we lived in Arizona, so I guess it made sense in her mind to tell me about them. In fact, she would always tell me how she had a really terrible sighting about 10 years before I was born, and I was born in 1975. She said she was walking home from a party late at night and saw a dog on the side of the road. She decided to try and catch it because she loved dogs. As she ran towards it, it stood up on 2 legs and ran away from her. She ran after it for a bit but got too tired and had to stop. At that point, the thing turned around and looked at her, and she said that its face then morphed into something that looked like a person's, and its fur had turned a grayish color, but it still had the body of a dog. She said it looked like it was smiling at her, and she totally freaked out. She lost it, and she ran home as fast as she could. And then she told me that she saw the same thing again when I was a kid. She said she was driving home late one night. She was a nurse, so this was normal for her. And she saw a dog in the middle of the road. She turned the wheel and drove into the oncoming lane to avoid it because there were no other cars on the road, and she ended up on the side in a ditch. She then looked back at the dog and said that it had looked like a dog, but then it stood up on 2 legs and smiled at her, which brought the first encounter flooding back into her memory. But for some reason, this time, she wasn't as scared, and so she opened the car door, but that when she got out of the car, it was gone. She looked for it, but there was no sign of it, so she got back in her car and drove the rest of the way home. She told me this a few times, but I was young and I didn't really believe the stories at the time. I thought it was just a made-up story to scare me, keep me in line. But then there was this one time when I was about 18 years old. It was in the early 90s. Some friends and I decided to go camping out in the woods behind the house. We went there a lot, so we knew the area well. We'd been there for most of the day, and we were just hanging out and listening to music. We had a fire going, we were roasting hot dogs, having a good time. And that's when one of my friends said he had to pee, so he went off into the woods. But he stopped and looked behind him because he felt like something was watching him. He turned around, and he said he saw a dog walk out of the bushes and stand up on its hind legs and smile. He said it kept watching him, and it kept standing up taller and taller, straightening itself until it morphed into a grown man, but taller. He honestly thought he was hallucinating, which scared the hell out of him, and he then ran back as fast as he could to us and told us what he saw. For a second, we all thought he was joking, but that's when we started hearing the very loud howling noise, and it scared the crap out of all of us. We ran back to my house immediately. When we got back, I asked my mom to tell them about skinwalkers, and she sat us all down and told us that they're real, and that they actually have the ability to turn into a man. My friends were sitting there with their eyes as wide as saucers, listening to her. And that's when my mom told us that that's what she saw when she was walking home from the party that day so many years ago. It all made sense. Later, my friend told me that the next day he went back into the woods to see if there were any signs of what had happened, but there was nothing. It was like it never happened, so we all had to wrap our heads around that. And so my mom passed away a few years ago from cancer, but I'm pretty sure that we all saw the exact same thing. I still have some of those same friends, and we talk about the story every once in a while. And we share our individual stories about how sometimes we hear howling and we laugh about it, but that it creeps us out a little. So anyway, I don't know if I told this story very well, but I wanted to tell it exactly as it happened. At least how I remembered it. I'm pretty sure it was a skinwalker, like my mom said. What do you think? In 1988, I was working as a police officer in southern West Virginia. I had just come off night shift and was headed home, and this day I decided to take a different way home so I could see the sunrise over the mountains. The area where I lived was in the very southern part of West Virginia, near the Kentucky border, about 20 miles from Blacksburg, Virginia. The area is heavily wooded and has small farms interspersed throughout it. There were no large open areas or hills as far as the eye could see. On my drive south, there were patches of fog everywhere that day, even though it was starting to get light out. So as I approached a sharp curve in the road ahead of me, something caught my attention on the other side of the highway at about 100 yards in the distance. It was standing next to an old farmhouse's driveway entrance, which led into a field behind it. I slowed down to get a better look and realized I was looking at a large black dog. It was very tall, with long legs, and had its head down as if sniffing the ground. Its back was arched slightly as it stood there. I thought maybe someone's dog got loose and wandered onto the highway, which did happen often. But as I got closer to it, I noticed that its right shoulder was hunched up higher than the rest of its body. At first, I thought maybe it had hurt itself, but wondered if this was maybe just how it stood naturally. As I drove even closer now, about 10 car lengths away, I could see that this dog thing had pointed ears like a German shepherd's ears, but they were much larger in proportion to its head than any dog's ears should be. Also, the size of the thing compared to a German shepherd was massive. It stood about 3.5 to 4 feet at the shoulder and looked as if it weighed at least 200 pounds. Its fur or hair was very dark black, and it seemed to blend into the fog so that only its outline could be seen. The sun wasn't totally up yet, so there wasn't enough light for me to tell exactly what color its fur was other than it appeared black. I passed it by slowly and noticed that it never once lifted its head from where it sniffed on the ground. And there was also something else about the way it stood that made me think it wasn't a dog, but rather a large, black, wolf-like animal. I continued on for another quarter mile or so, having passed by it without it giving any indication that it had seen me, and then I turned around to see if I could get another look at this dog. By now, the fog had lifted a bit, and the sun was beginning to rise over the mountains in front of me. When I turned my head around and looked where I had originally seen this thing standing by the driveway entrance, there was nothing there. No animal, no shadows, no marks, nothing. So I turned my patrol car around and I drove slowly back past where it was standing, and I looked as hard as I could, trying to see if maybe it had ducked into the nearby farm's driveway or behind the house itself, but there was no sign of it at all. I even drove right up to the edge of the road, right where I could see directly behind the house. I mean, there was no place back there for this dog to hide in the open field without me seeing its body. As I continued on past the spot, now going in the opposite direction, I kept looking into my rearview mirror because I kept getting these glimpses of what appeared to be the large black dog following me. And this totally freaked me out because it seemingly reappeared out of nowhere. Now I was on alert and quickly did another U-turn and headed back towards the thing. As soon as I turned around and headed back towards it, this animal disappeared again. Whatever it was seemed intelligent enough to know when someone is getting too close for comfort, and so it took off. I didn't tell too many people about this because most would have said that it couldn't have been anything out of the ordinary. Plus, saying these things when you're a police officer might not be the best idea, since people can lose confidence in you. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't any kind of dog that I've ever seen before or since. I did a little research on black wolves after this happened and found out that there are some in the United States, but they're very rare. Also, their ears aren't as large as what I saw. That might sound crazy to some, but after researching this for years, I've concluded that what I saw was some kind of a cryptid-like animal, something that has no official classification. Whatever it was, though, it wasn't afraid of people or cars, and seemed to be more curious about sniffing out something nearby than about me passing by. I have no idea why this thing would be in the middle of nowhere in southern West Virginia, but let me just tell you, be very careful if you are ever in the area. On September 21st, 2005, my friend and I were hiking up the Clackamas River near Sunstrip Campground. We were returning from a short day hike to Pup Creek Waterfall and decided to take our time and enjoy the scenery on our way back to camp. We had hiked about 1 mile upriver from the campground when we came upon a large log that was lodged across the river. My friend is an avid fly fisherman, so we stopped to see if he could spot any good fishing spots around the log. I sat down and started digging around in my pack to get my trail mix, while he walked around on the little bit of rocky shore. We weren't there more than a few minutes when we heard what sounded like a large stick breaking, about 50 yards upriver from us. It was loud and strange enough that we looked at each other and decided to move out of the area further down the bank. I'm not sure why, as it could have just been another hiker, but both of us tucked in behind the brush and watched the opposite side. And we didn't have to wait long before my friend noticed something moving in the trees on the other side of the river. He pointed it out to me without saying a word, and I could see what appeared to be a large, hairy arm reaching up into the tree. It would break a few branches and then trample the area around it before ambling around again. It did this maybe 3 or 4 times. We were both squinting through the bushes and saplings, trying to see what exactly it was. "I think it's marking its territory," I whispered. I just kept thinking of how bears rub their backs on trees and scratch them up. It seemed sort of like that. "Okay," my friend whispered back, "but what is it?" We watched the creature for about 10 minutes as it moved from tree to tree. It was definitely taller and broader than my friend, who was close to 6 feet, and it could have been mistaken for a bear standing up on its back feet, except that it had reddish-brown hair. It seemed to be looking for something on the ground and would stop every few moments to break branches or stomp the ground. My friend and I were trying to figure out what we were seeing when it broke a branch, and that gave us a clear line of sight to it. And that's when it noticed us. "It's a Bigfoot," my friend gasped, and then turned around and without another word started crashing through the trees back to the trail. I followed him, not wanting to see what would happen if I stayed around, and kept looking at the thing. We must have run almost a mile back to the campground before we both slowed down, too winded to continue. But we kept walking quickly, just in case. "Did you get a good look at it?" I asked him. And then we talked about the things we'd noticed. The hair, how it was walking on 2 legs, the long arms, and the fact that it definitely wasn't a bear. Neither of us had been able to clearly see any facial features because the river was sort of wide right there. Well, the next day we convinced a few people we'd met at the campground to check out the area with us again, though we didn't have the guts to tell them why. They thought we were just looking for a good fishing spot. My friend and I gingerly crossed and looked around where we had seen the creature, but there were clear signs that something had been there, but nothing was. Aside from the broken branches that we'd heard snapping, the bank was pretty wet too, and we could see deep footprints. The prints were a little malformed after a full day in the elements, but we both knew what we were looking at. Once we'd had time to calm down after seeing it the day before, we both felt more intrigued. And now, when we hike, we usually invite a few friends, but we also keep an eye out. I wouldn't mind seeing something like that again, to be honest, to get a better look at it and determine if it really was a Bigfoot, like my friend said. At the time this happened, my husband was a trucker and was working long weeks. He was usually gone 2 to 3 days at a time back then, so it was just me and our 2 dogs alone at home. We had bought a great cabin right at the edge of the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest after getting married. On this particular day, I was going to be home alone for another 2 days when I decided to take my dogs for a walk down by the stream in the backyard. It's only a few hundred feet away from the back door, so it's nice to get them out in summer. We live on a pretty quiet road, the dogs are well behaved, so I had them off leash. We walked down the backyard and I sat on a log to watch them play in the water for a while, and then after about 20 minutes I noticed that they had stopped playing and they were just sitting at the edge of the water staring upstream. Our nearest neighbor's almost 15 miles away, so I thought maybe it was a deer or another animal that caught their attention. A few minutes later, my older dog got up and started sniffing around like he was trying to pick up a scent trail. He kept sniffing around for a while before he took off running up the stream. And then about 5 minutes later, he came running back down towards me. But then he stopped about 50 feet away and just sat there looking back upstream again. My younger dog was now sitting on the log with me, but he started whining. He's always been nervous in general, but this was unusual. It got my attention. I decided that it was time for us to head back home since neither of them were interested in playing anymore and something was distracting them, which was worrisome. As we were walking back up the hill to the house, I noticed something now moving through the trees on the other side of the stream, maybe a quarter mile from where we had been sitting. From that far away, it looked like a very large man wearing camo clothes, moving slowly through the trees along the edge of a clearing in the forest. But it didn't really move like a human. It's hard to explain, but the arms and legs looked longer than usual. It didn't seem to notice us, and I kept watching it as best as I could while trying not to make any noise or move too quickly up the trail, as I didn't want it to notice us. The dogs both had their tails tucked between their legs, which was definitely concerning. We got up on the porch and into the house, but then the back door slammed behind us. I turned around to see if the thing in the woods turned its body in our direction. It had definitely heard the noise. I closed the main door and locked it, and then I went to a window quickly to look out. For a few minutes I didn't see it and thought that whatever it was gone further into the woods. But by this time both of my dogs were shaking badly and seemed terrified. It was weird that they weren't calming down, so after a few minutes I walked around and looked out each window again. This time, the thing was in our yard, and it definitely wasn't human. It was hidden a bit between 2 pine trees, but close enough that I could see what I thought was a camo outfit at first was actually brownish, dark-colored fur. It shifted from foot to foot, and I ducked back, afraid it could see me. My heart was now pounding. And then after what felt like an eternity, it finally turned and walked out into plain view right across from the back door. The creature seemed to be sniffing the air around while it stood there. It was very tall, and it had broad shoulders and long arms. The dark hair covered its body except for its face, which was lighter in color, and its head looked slightly pointed or something, but I couldn't really see the face since it was turned away from me. Eventually, it started walking down through the small field that we'd crossed to get to the stream and then disappeared into the trees. I watched until I could no longer see it as it moved further and further away from our house. The dogs were both now crying even though they hadn't seen it again. I ran for the phone fast and called my husband on his cell phone. I told him that something had just been standing back behind the house looking at us and sniffing the air like it was trying to pick up a scent. He thought that I was joking with him, but after telling him several times that I was not joking, he started to believe me. The dogs crying in the background probably helped, too. After a few minutes of talking on the phone with him, he said that he would call me back in 15 minutes when his truck stopped for a break. When he called back, I told him exactly where the creature had walked through the yard and that it was heading north. He told me to take the dogs and head to one of our friends' houses, closer to a bigger town, until he could get home in 2 days. I did exactly what he said, and when he finally got home, we walked the property with the friend and 2 of his other buddies. The dogs would not leave our side. We didn't find anything except for some snapped branches, but I didn't feel comfortable being alone at the house for long periods of time after that. My husband took a job in town, and now when I take the dogs out, I basically stay close to the yard, and I'm on alert pretty much the whole time. I'm not sure what it was that we saw, but it was big enough for me to realize that humans definitely aren't the top predator. Hopefully, it was just passing through. Border Patrol agents are a rare breed. They have to be. Their job is to patrol the most remote, dangerous, and unforgiving parts of our country. They're the first line of defense for our nation's borders. They must be physically fit, mentally sharp, highly trained, and able to think on their feet. They are the best of the best because they have to be able to think and act quickly. Sometimes, even 1 second can mean the difference between life and death, especially if you're dealing with drug cartels or human smugglers. So the border can be a dangerous place every day, but it becomes even more so at night. On the evening of April 24th, 2007, Border Patrol agent Lonnie Swenson was patrolling the Mexican border with Arizona. He was patrolling the north-south section of the border just south of Yuma, the area near the Colorado River, when he came across something he wasn't expecting at all. It was approximately 11 o'clock at night, and he was driving along the dirt road that parallels the border and winds near the river, when he noticed something moving and darting quickly off to his left. Naturally, his first thought was that it was an illegal movement of some kind. So he turned his vehicle to face the movement, slowed to a stop, and then turned his vehicle's spotlights on to look out into the darkness. The following moments changed his life forever. As he looked into the darkness, scanning for signs of illegal activity, his eyes landed on an animal unlike anything he has ever seen before. It was massive, and something he could not have expected. He later said the animal looked like a wolf, but huge, with orange-yellow eyes and long claws that resembled those of a bear. He next said that he heard growling sounds coming from the animal as it crouched and stared at him through the brush. He drew his pistol and began to approach what he called the beast, still not knowing what he was dealing with. And then suddenly it stood up on its hind legs and began to growl at him even louder. Agent Swenson said that it was now taller than a man, standing on its hind legs, taller than a man by about a foot. He estimated that the creature weighed about 250 pounds. He also noted that he could see the animal's ribs through its grayish-white fur, and that it had an elongated snout with long fangs protruding from its mouth. He said it was fit and muscular, wolf-like, but it essentially had the build of a man. The agent says that after staring at it for a few seconds with his pistol drawn, the beast turned around and ran away from him on 2 feet. It moved surprisingly fast for something of its size. Agent Swenson then returned to his patrol car and followed the creature as it ran through the desert. He estimated it was traveling at speeds of up to 35 miles an hour. He chased the beast for about 6 miles before losing sight of it. Agent Swenson says that he has no idea what the creature was, but he's certain it wasn't a wolf or a bear. He also said that he didn't believe it to be a cryptid because there have been sightings of similar creatures near the same area, but few people talk about them. Agent Swenson personally suspects that the animal is some sort of a hybrid creature created by drug cartels, who are known to experiment on animals in order to use them as weapons against agents. The agent noted that this isn't the first time something like this has happened in the area. A few years ago, another Border Patrol agent reported seeing a dark-colored wolf-like animal with yellow eyes while on patrol. The animal reportedly chased him down and nearly attacked him before running away into the night. It's not clear what exactly this creature is, but it seems to have some supernatural abilities. If Agent Swenson is correct in his assumptions about these animals being hybrids created by drug cartels, then we may be looking at the result of illegal experiments on wolves and bears. These animals could be bred for specific purposes, such as attacking Border Patrol agents or scaring off trespassers. He's well aware that some people think his ideas are far-fetched, but whatever the case may be, these creatures are hopefully something that few people will ever experience firsthand. I wouldn't admit this to most people, but since I'm not sharing my name here, I feel safe saying it. The truth is that being a park ranger in a national park can be completely overwhelming. For example, sometimes you need to keep secrets that can eat you up inside. I'm a park ranger here in Yosemite National Park, and I've been working here for about 8 months now, and I'm still getting used to the job and learning new things. You see, we have a lot of so-called secrets that we keep from the general public. For example, did you know that we have a file that we keep that's basically filled with things that park rangers have experienced that can't be explained? I've been told to keep these secrets to myself and to never share them with anyone. But sometimes it's hard not to say anything at all, which is why I'm writing to you now, anonymously. To start with, there was this one time when I had a really close call with what I think was a wendigo. It all started on my first week of work. I was assigned to patrol the north side of the park. That day I was patrolling the woods and I was going to check out a report of an injured deer. It turned out that it was a dead deer, but as I was walking closer to the carcass, I noticed something moving in the trees, something that seemed to be tracking or following me. At first I thought it was a bear or another large animal. As I got closer, though, I realized that this thing looked like a man, but not quite. It had dark hair all over its body and long arms and claw-like hands. Its eyes were bright red and its mouth was dripping saliva, and it was snarling at me. Also on its head I could see what looked to be horns, but one side was longer and more intact than the other. And that made me wonder, what kind of fight had this thing been in? And then as I stared at it, the creature started growling at me more ferociously and began running towards me. Thinking quickly, but not doing as I was trained at all, I pulled out my gun and shot at it several times. Unfortunately for me, though, this thing seemed to be almost bulletproof. All the bullets seemed to do is anger the creature, and it kept approaching. Once I realized that I and my gun were no match for it, I jumped back into my vehicle and drove away as fast as I could. But the creature was faster still. It kept on chasing after me, and it seemed to be enjoying my fear and staying just close enough behind my vehicle to really rattle me. I knew there was no way I could beat this thing. Luckily for me, though, I rounded a corner in the road and came upon other rangers patrolling the area. I started honking my horn, screaming out my window. Thank God they heard my screams for help, and they turned around and started driving towards me. The creature then stopped chasing me and now turned to face the rangers as they approached it. The creature faced them and took a stance that very clearly said, "Do not get any closer." All I could now see was this thing staring at the rangers with its bright red eyes, snarling at them and growling like a rabid animal. The rangers slowed down their vehicle, but as soon as they realized what was happening, they did not stop, but rather they yelled at me to follow them. I did as they said and followed them back to the station. Once we got there, they told me that what I saw was a wendigo, and that it's not something you can kill. I told them I had no idea what that was, and then they explained to me that this creature lives in the woods around here, and it feeds on deer and other animals, but that sometimes it will prey on humans too. They also told me that if it thinks you're food, it will try to kill you. For obvious reasons, they don't tell new hires about it until they have to. So, as you can imagine, I'm still living in fear of being attacked by this thing again. Whenever I'm out in the field, I'm nervous. And even though I've been trained better than this, when things get really crazy out there, I pray. I had been working as a park ranger at Little Buffalo State Park in central Pennsylvania for about 6 months when I had my first encounter. It was the end of summer, August of 2006. My partner and I were driving around the park at night to do a final check of our area for the evening. We were about halfway through our section of the park when we got a call from dispatch saying that there was a camper who wanted us to come out and take a look at his RV. He thought it had been vandalized or broken into or something. I told dispatch no problem and that we would be there shortly. We turned our vehicle around and arrived at this campsite within 5 minutes or so. There we found a gentleman in his mid-60s standing outside his camper looking very nervous. He walked up to our trucks as we pulled up, quickly opened the passenger door, and asked if we could please take a look inside. His behavior was very unusual, and so we cautiously agreed and walked over to the camper with him, following closely behind us. He was very nervous and kept looking around the entire time, almost like he was expecting something to jump out at him. We took a quick look inside the camper and found nothing that appeared to be out of place or missing. I asked him if anything had been taken from inside, and he said no, but that there were some things that he thought were moved around during the short time he was gone. I looked around for another minute or so before telling him that I didn't see anything wrong, and I thanked him for calling us about it. As we started walking back towards our truck, my partner, who is an avid hunter, said, "Did you smell that?" I stopped walking for a second because I honestly didn't notice any kind of odor other than the normal smell of a state park campground, mildew, pine trees, etc. My partner spent many hours in the woods, and he knows his smells. He told me that it smelled like something was trying to cover up a scent. And now that he said that, I did notice it too. It was a very light odor, but definitely there. We looked around for another minute or so before my partner said, "I think we need to get out of here." So we got into our truck and drove off towards the main area of the park, which is about a mile away from where we were at this campsite. We navigated our way up the path, and as soon as we got onto the main road that travels through the park, we both saw it. We saw what looked like a 7 or 8 foot tall creature walking down the road. I was driving, so I couldn't get a good look at it exactly, but my partner saw it walk out into the road, right across in front of us, up about 100 yards, and then quickly cross to the other side where there was more vegetation and trees. He said that he could only see its backside as it walked across the road, but that it had very wide shoulders, almost too wide for its body. He also said that he thought he could see long black hair covering its arms and shoulders, but again not sure because it was dark. We drove around looking for this thing a bit, maybe about an hour after that, trying to pinpoint it. But we had no luck finding anything else unusual, so we eventually gave up and returned to the office. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I went back to the site myself in hopes of finding any evidence of what we had seen and smelled there before. but I found nothing out of place or unusual in any way. I decided to just move on and not focus on it since no concrete evidence could be found. But I've heard of other encounters in this area, which makes me believe that there is something going on here for sure. Also, I've heard rumors of other sightings reported around this area and all the way over to Harrisburg. Anyway, that's my story. I'm not here to convince anyone that what I saw was real, but I know what I saw and smelled was real. Also, there have been several reports of dead deer in the area. Deer that have been torn apart but not eaten, which is very unusual to say the least. So now I'm starting to think that I'm wondering if they're connected in some way. The most common theory among hunters around here is that something is killing the deer for sport, and then covering up its tracks or scent with another odor to mask its own. I can't quite figure out how that would work, but that's what some people are saying. In the end, I'm really not sure exactly what to think is going on, or how to even think about it at all, but I'm really glad to have you to tell it to. Thanks for being here for me to share it with you. It definitely makes me feel better about everything. If I hadn't seen it for myself, I never would have believed it. The year was about 1978 or 79. I was about 15 or 16 years old. My mother and I were driving home from visiting some friends one night in our '74 Impala. It was dark. The roads were winding and hilly. We were on a long stretch of highway about 30 miles from home. The highway had a long, sweeping turn to the right, and we were in the middle of that turn. My mother was driving, obviously. And then suddenly on the other side of the road, in the field by the edge of the woods, something big and dark ran out from there and into the road. It was too far away for me to make out any details, but it was big, and it was moving fast. It looked like a big dog. It looked like it was going to run straight into the side of our car, and I remember saying, "Look out, Mom, there's a dog in the road." But it didn't hit us. It stopped at the last second, turned around, and ran back into the woods on the other side of the road. I was actually amazed that we had missed it, but I was also relieved that we didn't hit it. My mom said, "Did you see that?" I said, "Yes, but I don't know what it was." We talked about how strange it was for a dog to be out in the middle of a cornfield like that at night, and how lucky we were to not have hit it. A few minutes later, we came around another turn in the road, and there, beside the road, stood this huge thing, at least 7 feet tall. It had its back to us as it peered into one of those little farm fields where they grow just enough corn for the cows or pigs or whatever to feed on. It looked like some kind of big ape standing there, with its arms down by its sides. The fur was dark brown or black. It was very impressive looking, but also scary. I told my mom to stop. She stopped the car immediately and backed up a little bit. We both sat there for a few seconds trying to figure out what we were seeing. We were scared, but also curious. And to tell you the truth, since I was young and stupid, I was even thinking that I wanted to get out of the car and go up to it when suddenly it turned around and looked right at us. Well, that did it for me. I was now officially terrified. It had a human face, but its eyes glowed red like a cat's eyes in the headlights. I remember thinking right then that if we could see its face, then it could see ours. I ducked down into the car as fast as I could so it couldn't see me, but I could still see it. The creature stood there for a few seconds looking at us, and then it turned and ran off into the cornfield on the other side of the road and was gone in just a few seconds. My mother had a look on her face like I've never, ever seen before. She started the car and we drove home as fast as we could, amazingly without getting pulled over by a cop for speeding. When we got home, we went straight to my stepfather, who was a county sheriff's deputy. We told him our story and he just laughed. He said it was definitely a black bear. He said they do get that big sometimes. I don't even know why we thought he would believe us anyway. He definitely didn't. But I had seen the thing with my own eyes, and I knew it was not a bear or any kind of animal I've seen before, but I didn't dare argue with him. And to this day, I've barely told anyone this story. I don't even talk to my mom about it. Well, until I'm sharing it now with you.